Section 1. Before the world was soft. Primordial chaos, the first entities, and the age of dinosaurs. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a universe that has not yet decided what it wants to be. There are no mountains yet, no oceans with names, no creatures with eyes to watch the stars wheel overhead and wonder what they mean. There is only potential, vast, humming, ancient potential, the kind that exists before anything has been broken into parts, before the first separation of light from dark, warmth from cold, the living from the not living. This is where Adventure Time begins. Not with a boy and his dog in a treehouse, not with a candy kingdom or a vampire queen or an old man screaming into a blizzard. It begins here in a bayou in a place so old it barely has a name. The show called it The Time Before Time, and that is a good enough name for what it was. A kind of endless before, and even in that before, something existed. The entity that would come to be known as Golb was not born. It did not grow from anything. It simply was. The way gravity simply is, the way darkness simply is when there is no light to push it back. Golb is the embodiment of Kea, pure, irreducible, ancient chaos, the kind that does not destroy things because it wants to, but because destruction and transformation are what chaos does. Chaos does not hate order. It is simply allergic to it. It cannot look at a thing that has been sorted and organized and made coherent without feeling. In whatever passes for its blood, the urge to dissolve it back into its original fog. Golb is not evil in the way a villain is evil. It has no plan. It has no grudge. It is simply a force as enormous and indifferent as a tide, and tides do not apologize for what they wash away. But the universe is not only chaos, there is also something else. Something that emerged in answer to Golb. The way every force seems to summon its opposite eventually. This is a harder thing to name, and Adventure Time only hints at it. A kind of cosmic order, a shape beneath the shapelessness. The show suggests that from this tension between the raw entropy of Golby and the organizing impulse that answered it, the universe began to form. From that formation, in the fullness of time, came the very first of what the show calls elementals. The elementals are not gods exactly, though they are older than almost anything else. They are living embodiments of the four fundamental forces that shape the natural world: fire, ice, candy, and slime. Yes, candy. We will talk about why candy is a fundamental force of the universe in due time, and it will make more sense than you might expect. But for now, hold on to the image. Four great forces, given will and shape and the ability to think, existing at the very dawn of everything, long before the first human ever looked up at the sky and felt small. The elementals do not stay constant. They are not immortal in the way that rocks are immortal. They cycle. When one embodiment dies, the power passes on, moving through bloodlines, through chance, through the mysterious logistics of a universe that wants these forces to remain represented in the world. The show implies that this has been happening for longer than history can reach. That there have been thousands of elementals over the eons, living their lives and passing their essence forward like a torch that never goes out. We only know a handful of them by name. We meet some across the timeline. But the first elementals we truly encounter in the deep lore of the show lived in a world that most viewers have never imagined as the Adventure Time universe, the age of dinosaurs, long before the Mushroom War, long before the Candy Kingdom, long before the Ice Crown or the Lich or any of the sorrows that would come. The world was ruled by enormous creatures that shook the ground when they moved and swallowed the sky with their size. And among them walked, or slithered or stomped, creatures called elementals, carrying within them the primordial forces of fire and ice and candy and slime. And then there was Urgent's Evergreen. Urgent's Evergreen was a tyrannosaurid, a giant lizard in the shape of power, ancient even for that ancient world. He was also the ice elemental of his age, the embodiment of cold and stillness and the hard clarity of frozen things. He was brilliant in the way that dangerous intellects are brilliant, absolutely certain of his own correctness, utterly convinced that what he wanted was also what was best. He was in many ways a man you would admire from a distance and fear up close. Evergreen had an apprentice named Gunther. Gunther was small and young and worshipful in the way that young creatures are when they find someone enormous to believe in. He followed Evergreen everywhere. He watched everything Evergreen did. He absorbed Evergreen's mannerisms, his speech patterns, his cold, aristocratic certainty. He wanted, more than anything, to be what Evergreen was. But he was not the only one paying attention. The world itself was watching the sky. A comet was coming. Not just any comet. The green comet, the one the lore would eventually call the Lich's Comet. A comet whose impact the ancient astronomers of the dinosaur age predicted would devastate the world. Not the end of everything, perhaps, but the end of an age. The end of the giant things that walk the earth. Evergreen knew this. He had studied the comet. He understood what it meant. And being Evergreen, being brilliant and cold and absolutely certain, he did not sit and wait for it. He devised a plan. He would build a crown, not a crown for ruling, or at least not primarily, a magical crown, a vessel of unimaginable power, imbued with the essence of the four elementals working in concert. A crown that could grant a wish, any wish, one wish, strong enough to alter the course of a comet, to stop it before it shattered the world he knew. He set Gunther the task of helping construct it. The two of them labored on the crown in Evergreen's great ice fortress, working with magic and craft and the deep, ancient power of the ice elemental. The crown took shape slowly. It grew more powerful by the day. And as it grew, Evergreen drilled Gunther on exactly what to wish for. Say exactly these words, he told him. Wish to stop the comet. Do not deviate. Do not try to be clever. Say the words and let the crown do the work. Gunther listened. Gunther nodded. Gunther watched Evergreen with his enormous, worshipful eyes. And then something went wrong. Evergreen was killed, not by the comet, but by the other elementals. The exact circumstances are a kind of ghost story, glimpsed only in fragments. What matters is that when the crown was finally completed, it was Gunther who put it on. Small, young, grieving Gunther, who had lost the only being he had ever truly admired. He stood in the cold light of the approaching comet. He felt the crown settle onto his head. He felt the power move through him like electricity through water, enormous and impossible and demanding something of him. Demanding the one thing he was supposed to say, the words Evergreen had taught him. And what Gunther wished for, in that moment, in front of the comet that would change everything, was to be like Evergreen. Not to stop the comet, not to save the world, not the careful, rational wish that had been drilled into him for months. He wished to be like the being he had loved and lost. Because grief does not negotiate and does not wait. And Gunther was very young and very sad, and that was all there was room for. The comet hit. The world of the dinosaurs ended. And the crown, having received a wish it could not properly grant, having been asked to do something that was about identity and longing rather than physics and trajectory, was broken in a specific, terrible way. It still held power. It still eventually would grant a form of what had been wished. But it was warped by that first wish, twisted into something that pulled at the identity of whoever wore it, reaching always for something else, something lost, something the wearer longed to be. The crown became a trap built from the shape of one small creature's grief, set to spring on every head it would ever touch. The comet hit. The dinosaurs did not survive. The green comet, because it was not merely a rock, but a cosmic event, left something behind in the crater where it struck. A corruption, a contamination, a wrongness seeping into the earth and the water and the slow future. The first seed of what would eventually become the Lich. But that story is for later. For now, let the dust settle. Let the world rebuild itself in the long silence after catastrophe. The first age ended. The world began again. And somewhere in the ice, in the mountain halls of a vanished civilization, a crown waited. It had all the time in the universe. If you are enjoying this journey through the lore of Ooh, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Let us know where in the world you are listening from, what time it is, and whether or not this is helping you drift off. Your comments mean more than you know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a perfect moment. Every new subscriber helps this channel keep making content like this. Now close your eyes a little tighter, and let's keep going. Section 2. The Catalyst Comets and the Eternal Cycle of Change. The universe in the world of Adventure Time is not random. This is one of the quieter things the show asks you to believe, and it sneaks up on you gradually, the way most profound things do. On the surface, the story is full of chaos, wars and magic and strange accidents and bad decisions made by people who should have known better. But underneath all of it, there is a pattern, a deep, slow rhythm that the universe beats out across millennia, caring nothing for the small lives that rise and fall inside it. Comets are part of that rhythm. In the lore of Adventure Time, certain comets are not merely rocks. They're more like delivery mechanisms or visitations, or the universe's way of pressing its thumb down on the world and saying, here, this place, now something changes. Each comet carries within it a specific kind of energy, a specific kind of being or potential being. And when it arrives not by accident. It arrives because it is time for something to arrive. The show calls these the Catalyst Comets, and there are 4 of them that matter most to the story we are telling. The first is the Green Comet, the one we already know, the one that ended the dinosaur age and left its poison in the earth. The Green Comet did not carry life in the way the others did. It carried death, or rather, it carried the seed of something that would grow from death, that would need death the way fire needs air, that would eventually become the greatest evil in the world of Ooh. The Lich was not born on that day, not fully. That birth was still far in the future. But the Green Comet planted the seed. Whatever struck the ancient world on that terrible day left something in the rock and soil that would not die, that would wait, patient as geology, for the conditions it needed to finally become what it had always been meant to become. The Green Comet's energy is death. Specifically, the death of all things. The obliteration of every life that has ever tried to climb up out of the nothing and insist it mattered. There is a will to it, a purpose. And it is important to understand that the Lich, when it finally emerges, is not simply a monster. It is a philosophy. It is the universe having an opinion about life, and that opinion is it should not exist. Life is a mistake. Complexity is a mistake. Every flower and every child and every spark of love or curiosity or hope is a mistake. The universe is cleaner without them, simpler. Right. The Lich believes this the way some people believe in arithmetic. calmly, completely, without the need for anyone else to agree. But we are not there yet. We have more comets to visit. The second comet is the yellow comet, and it carries something very different. It carries a being of pure destruction, not the quiet, cold obliteration of the Lich, but a roaring, consuming, hungry destruction, the kind that eats worlds not out of philosophy, but out of appetite. This comet gave rise to a creature that, in its original form, was one of the most powerful entities in the universe, Orgalorg. Orgalorg predates almost everything. It is described in the show as a being of primordial evil, a cosmic entity that once threatened to devour the light of the universe itself. It moved through the deep space between stars the way a shark moves through water, with absolute confidence, without doubt, without the concept of an obstacle that could not simply be consumed. Orgalorg was feared. Even things that were not easily frightened were frightened of Orgalorg. And at some point, the show does not tell us exactly when, but it was long ago, before the Mushroom War, before human civilization in its current form. Orgalorg came to Earth and was stopped by Grob Gob Glob Grud, four-faced celestial guardian of Mars, the show's equivalent of the angel or the divine sentinel, a being tasked with the protection of the solar system's planets. Grob Gob Glob Grud defeated Orgalorg, and, unable to destroy it entirely, compressed it, shrank it, squeezed all that cosmic hunger and power down into a form so small and so confused and so stripped of its own memory that it could not threaten anything. That compressed form crash-landed on Earth, and eventually, after many years of wandering and forgetting, it became Gunter the Penguin. Yes, that Gunter, Ice King's beloved little penguin companion, the one who breaks bottles and steals things and looks at the world with those flat black eyes and a kind of cheerful vacancy. Inside that small waddling body was once one of the most powerful destroyers the universe had ever known, sleeping, amnesiac, genuinely having a nice time. This is the kind of thing Adventure Time does so quietly and so completely that it deserves a moment of appreciation. The joke and the lore are the same thing. The absurdity is the truth. The third comet is the Purple Comet, and the Purple Comet is the most mysterious of all, perhaps the most mysterious element in the entire show's cosmology. It does not carry a destroyer or a seed of death. It carries something harder to name. The show implies it carries pure enlightenment, the highest kind of wisdom, the absolute understanding of what it means to exist, of why existence is beautiful and strange and worth the suffering it costs. The Purple Comet appears only briefly in the show, but what it offers in that brief appearance is staggering. When Finn encounters it during his arc toward the end of the series, the comet offers him a choice. He can leave the world behind. He can step into the comet and become something greater. Pure energy, pure understanding, free from the limitations of a body and a name and the particular heartbreaks of being Finn. He can transcend. He says no. We will come back to why he says no, because the reason he says no is one of the most quietly beautiful things the show ever does. But for now, the Purple Comet, enlightenment, the offer of transcendence. The question of whether becoming something more than human is something a human should ever want. The fourth comet is the Blue Comet, and the Blue Comet is Finn. Or rather, the Blue Comet carries the soul that keeps returning as Finn, the soul that the universe itself seems to be sending back again and again to this particular corner of existence. The show establishes that Finn is not simply a boy who was lucky enough to be found in the woods. He is a recurring presence, a specific pattern of consciousness that the universe keeps regenerating at critical moments. His earliest known incarnation in the show's lore is Shoko, a girl with one arm who lived in the time before the Candy Kingdom was fully formed. A thief and a wanderer who made a terrible mistake and whose ghost lingered for centuries in the roots of Finn and Jake's treehouse, unable to rest until the wrong was addressed. But Shoko was not the first either. The show implies there were others before her, other iterations of the same essential soul, cycling through the world the way the elementals cycle, never dying entirely, always coming back in new form when the world needs a particular kind of presence. Earnest, brave, physically limited, but spiritually enormous. Deeply committed to goodness without being naive about what goodness costs. Finn is the latest in this line, not the last, the show suggests. The cycle will continue after him, some new version of this particular soul, stepping into the world when the next critical moment arrives. What is it about this soul that the universe keeps recycling? What does Finn represent in the grand architecture of the cosmic story? The show never states it plainly, but the answer seems to be pure agency, pure choice. The capacity to look at the situation, however hopeless, however enormous, however stacked against you, and decide to act, not out of power, not out of certainty that things will work out of the simple conviction that choosing to try is better than choosing to give up. The Lich represents the universe's death wish, its entropy, its cold preference for simplicity over the messy warmth of living things. Finn represents the counter-argument, the universe's other voice, the one that keeps being born into small bodies with limited powers, over and over, because the argument is never finished. This is the architecture beneath the story. This is the skeleton inside the brightly colored cartoon. The universe is not simply chaotic. It is having a debate with itself across eons, using lives and deaths and comets as its vocabulary. The comets arc through the sky. Each one carries its cargo. Each one changes the world in its own particular way. And somewhere below, the changed world tries to figure out what to do next. Section 3. The Great Mushroom War. The World That Ended. Here's a difficult thing about the history of the world of Adventure Time. We are not given all of it. We are given fragments, photographs and torn pages, and the kind of evidence that archaeologists find after centuries have buried everything. Suggestive, evocative, incomplete, in exactly the ways that make the imagination work hardest to fill in the gaps. The show was never interested in giving us a complete history of the Mushroom War. It was interested in giving us enough to feel the weight of it, to understand in the marrow why the world that came after it is the way it is. But from those fragments, we can reconstruct something. Something that, the more carefully you look at it, the more familiar it feels. The world before the Mushroom War was our world, or something very like our world. The ruins of it are everywhere in ancient highways, skyscrapers half buried in overgrowth, shopping carts rusted orange in dried-up drainage ditches, cars furred with moss and flowers. The show places Adventure Time in the future, not a distant alien future, a recognizable future, the kind where you can see what the past was by the shape of what's still standing. There were people, there were cities, there was technology, extraordinary technology. The show implies beyond anything we have now. There was industry and infrastructure and all the complicated machinery of a civilization that had been growing and expanding and consuming for a very long time. And then they used too much of it against each other. The Mushroom War was a real war fought by real people with real weapons. But it was also something more than a war. It was the last war, The war to end, not the other wars, but everything. The show does not explain who started it or why or what particular grievance ignited the conflagration. Perhaps it was resources, perhaps ideology, perhaps the reasons were as small and stupid as the reasons most wars start. Someone was afraid, and someone else was afraid of their fear, and fear is extraordinarily good at becoming fire when you give it enough fuel. What we know is that nuclear and biological weapons were used. The show is remarkably clear about this in its oblique way. The imagery is unmistakable. Mushroom clouds, impact craters, cities turn to glass. The particular silence that falls after an explosion so enormous, it has already deafened everything within reach. And then there was the mushroom bomb. The mushroom bomb was not simply a nuclear weapon. It was something worse, something that combined the ordinary catastrophe of nuclear annihilation with the green comet's ancient corruption, the seed that had been sleeping in the earth since the dinosaur age. Whatever the bomb was made of, whatever it had been designed to do, when it detonated, it did something no weapon in the hands of human beings had ever done before. It created the Lich, not immediately, not in one instant of fire and revelation. The Lich coalesced out of the blast, grew from the mushroom cloud itself, the green radiation and the ancient evil forming into something with will and intelligence in a single, undeviating purpose. It rose from the fire the way a thought rises when you have finally found the words for something you have always half known. Suddenly, completely, with no way to put it back. And everything living within its immediate reach died. The Mushroom War casualties were staggering. We do not have a number. The show does not give us a number because some quantities are beyond the usefulness of counting. We can infer from the ruins of the world that follow that the war and its aftermath killed the overwhelming majority of human beings on the planet. Perhaps nearly all of them. The humanity that survived in Ooh 1,000 years later is tiny, scattered, coastal, a remnant that has largely forgotten what it was. But in those first days after the war, there were still survivors. People climbing out of craters and shelters in the wreckage of their homes, breathing the changed air, looking at the sky that was now a different color, trying to understand if there was still a world to survive in. One of those survivors, or one of those people who was above the blast radius, perhaps in an airplane, perhaps watching from a height, was a young woman. A PhD student in anthropology, as it happens. Her name was Betty Groff, and her story would not fully begin for many years yet, because the show's timeline is strange and layered, and she would not arrive in the post-war world by the normal method of simply being there. She came later, from before, by a path so improbable it would take the rest of the story to describe. Another survivor was a young man, a scholar of the occult and the unexplained, a collector of ancient artifacts, an academic who had spent his life pursuing mysteries with the dogged cheerfulness of someone who loves a puzzle more than he fears a dark answer. His name was Simon Petrikov, and Simon Petrikov had in his possession a crown, the very crown that Gunther had worn on the day the dinosaurs ended. The very crown that had been waiting in the ice for exactly this kind of man to find it, not because it was patient, but because crowns do not hurry. They simply remain, and the world eventually delivers to them whoever they are meant to destroy. Simon had found the crown in a remote region of the Arctic, purchased it from a dock worker of all things. He had brought it home to Betty, to his fiancée, to the woman he loved, with the easy certainty of someone who has found the thing they were always looking for. He had shown her the crown as a curiosity, a mystery, something they could study together. He had put it on just briefly, just to see. And everything began to change. But we will not rush to Simon's story yet, because first the world must finish dying, and in its dying create the conditions for the extraordinary, terrible, beautiful thing it would eventually become. The Mushroom War's aftermath was not quick. Catastrophe of that scale does not resolve itself in days or years. The sky changed, the weather changed, the chemistry of the soil and water and air changed. The magic that had always existed at the margins of the world, dormant, subtle, the kind you could spend your whole life not noticing, surged forward into the vacuum left by civilization's collapse. Because magic is not separate from the world, it is a part of it. One of the parts that industrial civilization had been suppressing and drowning out, the way the noise of a city drowns out birdsong. With the cities gone, with the machines rusting, with the human noise finally silenced, magic came back the way forests come back, irresistibly, generously, changing everything it touched. The plants changed, animals changed. Things that had been inanimate began slowly to develop will and awareness. A piece of chewing gum in a crater began to grow. A dog stretched out longer than dogs were supposed to stretch. The candy dropped from a shattered vending machine began to organize itself, slowly, over years, in the way that living things organize themselves when magic is the operating system of the world. The humans who survived did not know what they were witnessing. They could barely survive the winters, the blighted crops, the strange aggressive creatures that had previously been squirrels or deer, and were now something altogether less predictable. They huddled in their shelters, toys, and told each other stories about what had happened, and those stories changed over the generations until the war was a myth. And the myth was half forgotten, and the half forgotten thing was a landscape full of ruins that no one fully understood anymore. 1,000 years passed, and the world that came out the other side was ooh. Ooh is gorgeous. It is strange and wild and full of a joyful wrongness. A world where the rules of the old world no longer apply, and the new rules are being written by candy sentence and fire people and ice mages and the slow, deep magic that came roaring back after the silence. Ooh is what happens when the worst possible thing also creates space for extraordinary things to grow. But ooh is built on loss. Every piece of it. The treehouse that Finn and Jake live in grows from soil that was once a parking lot. The Candy Kingdom's walls incorporate fragments of a highway overpass. The treasures in the dungeons that Finn and Jake explore are sometimes old electronics from the before time. Circuit boards and cell phones and objects whose original purpose has been so thoroughly forgotten that they have been reinterpreted as magical artifacts. Ooh is a memorial to something it can no longer remember. And there are things in Ooh that remember what it cannot. The Lich remembers. The Lich, dormant in the ice, encased in amber, imprisoned over and over, and always eventually escaping, remembers the world that was. Not with nostalgia, the Lich has no nostalgia, but with purpose. The world that was made the bomb that made the Lich. The world that was, in its last convulsion of self-destruction, created the means of of its own deepest enemy. The Lich does not hate humans for this. The Lich does not hate. It simply intends. It intends to complete the work that the Mushroom War started. To take the 99% that died and round it up to 100%. To sand down the irregular, warm, chaotic fact of life until there is nothing left but the smooth, cold perfection of a universe that has achieved its preferred state. Empty. We will come back to the Lich. We will come back to it several times because the Lich does not stay contained and does not stay defeated and does not, unlike almost every other antagonist in the story, ever stop believing in what it is trying to do. For now, the world has ended. The world is rebuilding itself from the pieces. The magic has returned. and a man in a stolen crown is wandering in the ruins, becoming something other than himself. Section 4. Simon Petrikov, The Crown, and a Child in the Ruins. Simon Petrikov, before the crown, was a good man. This is important enough to say plainly because the story of what Simon becomes is so suffused with sadness that it is easy to forget what he was before the sadness took him. He was warm. He was curious. He was the kind of person who found joy in obscure things, in ancient artifacts and unanswerable questions, and the pleasure of a mystery that would take years to solve. He was engaged to be married to a woman named Betty, and he loved her with the uncomplicated fullness of someone who has found exactly the right person and knows it. He was, by any measure, a lucky man. And then he was very, very unlucky. The crown changed him gradually. This is the important thing to understand about the crown and what it does. It is not a sudden transformation. It is a slow one. The kind that is hardest to notice from the inside and most devastating to witness from outside. One day you are wearing a crown and having strange thoughts. A week later you are saying things you don't quite recognize as your own. A month later you are building ice structures in the middle of the night and not entirely sure who put them there. The crown peels away who you are in very thin layers, like geological erosion, so slow and steady that you might not notice until you look down and discover there is nothing left. Simon had put the crown on before the Mushroom War during his time with Betty, and the effects had already begun. He had taken it off and locked it away, frightened by what had happened to him while wearing it. He had written it all down, trying to document the experience, the way scientists document things when they are afraid of what they are finding. Betty had seen the tape. She had seen what the crown was doing to him. She had tried to get him to destroy it, to throw it into the ocean, to put it somewhere it could not find him again. But Simon could not destroy it. Whether this was already the crown's influence or simply his own academic attachment to the artifact, is one of those questions the story leaves unresolved. He kept it. He locked it away. He tried to live a normal life. Then the war happened. In the chaos of the Mushroom War, in the long, terrible months when the world was discovering what it had done to itself, Simon found a child. He found her in the rubble. Or she found him. The show never makes this entirely clear, and perhaps the difference does not matter. What matters is that after the bombs fell and the magic started to seep back in, and the world became a place where a grown man with no particular survival skills could easily die of loneliness or monsters, or simply the weight of having lost everything. In the middle of all that, Simon Petrikov found a small girl with a stuffed animal and an extraordinary voice. Her name was Marceline. She was very young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, and she was alive in the ruins the way some children are alive in disasters, with a pragmatic ferocity that astonishes the adults around them, as if children have not yet been taught that they are supposed to be more fragile than they are. She had been separated from her family. Her stuffed bear, Hambo, was clutched in her arms. She was dirty and scared, but she was not broken. And something about her, the look in her eyes, perhaps, or simply the mathematics of two people in a destroyed world finding each other, made Simon stay. He could not be her father. He knew this. He was becoming something else. Something that the crown was making inevitable, and he was not sure yet what that something was, but he was certain it was not compatible with being a parent. But he could be something. He could feed her when there was food. He could scare away the mutated creatures that were becoming bolder in the ruins. He could be, for a time, a kind of guardian, a presence between her and the worst of the world. He called her, in his letters, his little Marceline, and she called him Simon. They moved through the ruins together for what seems to have been several years, long enough for her to grow a little, long enough for his letters to describe her as a person he was coming to know, rather than simply a child he had found. Long enough for something that was not quite family, but was family shaped to form between them. During this time, Simon wore the crown more and more. This was not his choice, or not entirely. The monsters of the post-war world were real and dangerous, and the crown gave him powers. Extraordinary, sudden, enormous powers over ice and cold and weather. When he wore it, he could drive back things that would have killed them both. When he wore it, he could make a shelter in a blizzard from nothing. When he wore it, he could protect her. The cost was his mind. Each time the crown touched his head, it took a little more. A memory here. A piece of personality there. The warmth that was Simon Petrikov. His specific warmth, his curiosity, and his tenderness, being replaced by something colder and stranger and less coherent. The crown was doing what it had always done, reaching toward the wish Gunther had wished, the wish to be like the one who was lost. And in Simon's case, what it reached toward was a mad wizard version of isolation and cold, a character that was less Simon and more ice, less warmth and more wind. He knew this was happening. This is the unbearable thing about Simon's story. He could see himself losing himself. He wrote it down in letters to Betty, letters he had no way to send because Betty was gone. Betty had been pulled through a time portal to the distant past in an attempt to save him, and the details of how and why are for a later section. But he wrote the letters anyway, because writing them was a way of insisting that he was still there, that Simon Petrikov still existed inside whatever was wearing his face. One of those letters is one of the most heartbreaking pieces of dialogue in a children's animated show. He writes to Betty that he knows she would not like him as he is now. He writes that he is afraid. He writes that he found a little girl, and that protecting her is what he is doing with the last of himself, and that he hopes if Betty is somehow out there that she will understand. He writes hot, this part I remember. And then, less and less. There's a particular moment the show recreates in flashback that exists like a bruise in the memory of anyone who has seen it. Marceline, now a little older, 7 or 8 perhaps, is standing in a snowfield. Simon is in front of her and he is wearing the crown, and he is not entirely Simon anymore. He is raving, half coherent, saying things that don't quite connect. His eyes the icy blue of the crown's grip. He is still protecting her, still aware of her on some level, but the warmth is nearly gone and what is left is cold and strange. And then the crown slips from his head, and for just a moment, just a few seconds, Simon is there. Simon Petrikov, the man, looking at this child, understanding with terrible clarity what he has become and what is about to happen. He tells her she needs to find someone else, someone to take care of her, someone who is actually a person and not whatever he is becoming. He tells her she deserves better than this. And then the crown settles back into place, and the moment is gone. Marceline, who would become one of the most powerful beings in the world of Ooh, who would survive centuries and wars and heartbreak and the long loneliness of an immortal life, Marceline in that moment is just a child losing someone she loves. She put on a brave face, she moved on, she survived, the way she had always survived, with that pragmatic ferocity she'd had since the rubble. But she kept Hambo. She kept the stuffed bear Simon had given her, the one she had arrived with in the ruins. She kept it for 1,000 years. Not because she was sentimental, she would tell you, with the particular fierceness of someone who is deeply sentimental and very careful about who they show it to. She kept it because it was the thing from before, the thing that remembered a time when she was not alone. Simon, meanwhile, became the Ice King, not all at once, and not without resistance. But slowly, over years, the crown finished its work. Simon Petrikov disappeared into the noise of it, into the cold, into the manic obsessiveness of an identity that was built not from who he was, but from the accumulated psychic debris of a magical object carrying centuries of grief. The Ice King kidnapped princesses not out of malice, but out of a desperate, confused longing. For Betty, encoded somewhere deep in the crown's scrambled logic as princess, the word for person I need and have lost. He built a palace of ice and filled it with kidnapped royalty and penguins and did not know why. The citizens of Oo feared him. Finn and Jake fought him constantly in the way you fight a recurring nuisance more than an actual villain. Because the Ice King was irritating and dangerous, but not truly evil, which was confusing to everyone who had to deal with him. It would be centuries before the truth of Simon Petrikov was understood. Before Finn found the tapes. Before Marceline, sitting in the Ice Kingdom, allowed herself to feel the full weight of the 1,000 years between that snowfield and now. When she finally sang to him, in one of the show's most quietly devastating scenes, she sang a song she had written in the long years of his absence, about the specific grief of losing someone who is still alive. He did not remember her. The Ice King looked at this 1,000-year-old vampire queen and saw a stranger, and offered her the penguin and the company he always offered to strangers, because that was who he was now. The strange, cold man in the ice palace with his penguins and his confusion, endlessly reaching for something he could not name. Simon Petrikov was one of the most human tragedies in Adventure Time, and his story was not even close to finished. Section 5. The Mother Gum and the Birth of Bonnibel Bubblegum. In the years immediately following the Mushroom War, the world was not yet sure what it wanted to be. The ruins smoldered. The air was strange. The magic that had been waiting in the margins of the world was moving now, slowly and enormously, like a tide coming in. Not quickly, not all at once, but with the absolute certainty of something that has been held back for a very long time and is no longer being held back. Things were changing, animals were changing, plants were changing, and in one particular crater, in one particular place in the wreckage of the world, a mass of pink chewing gum was changing too. The substance that would eventually become the Candy Kingdom, that would eventually become Bonnibel Bubblegum herself, had its origins in the Mushroom War's aftermath. The details are fragmented in the show's canon, as they always are with the ancient past, but what is established is this. The gum was a survivor of the old world, a mass of candy matter that absorbed the ambient magic of the post-war world and began to develop consciousness. Not human consciousness, not right away. Something earlier and more fluid than that. A vast, slow, living awareness that spread through the gum as the gum spread through its crater. The show calls this the Mother Gum, and that is precisely the right name for it. Because what this growing conscious pink mass eventually did was birth. From itself, it created children. Specifically, it created two, Bonnibel and Nettie. They emerged fully formed, or as fully formed as newly born beings can be, from the living gum, carrying within them the mother gum's essential nature. A love of life, a deep responsiveness to the world, a biology built from sugar and magic, and the memory of a world that used to make candy in enormous factories and scatter it everywhere without thought. Bonnibel was alert from her first moment, curious, engaged, already processing the world around her with an intensity that would never really diminish. She looked at the ruins and the magic and the changing landscape and began immediately to think about what could be made from it. What structure could be imposed on this beautiful chaos? What could be built? Nettie was different. Nettie had taken in something the mother gum could not shield him from, the grief of the world, perhaps, or the residual horror of the war, or something specific to his particular configuration of consciousness. He was sensitive in a way that was barely compatible with ordinary existence. The ordinary world, its noise and demands and the sheer overwhelming fact of it, was too much for Nettie. He needed quiet. He needed the dark, the underground, the slow and gentle movement of sap and root and earth. He burrowed. Eventually, he burrowed into the roots of the great candy tree that would become the structural heart of the candy kingdom, and he stayed there, feeding on the earth and letting his own body process and distribute the energy that kept the kingdom sweet. He was not unhappy. This is important. Nettie was not a tragedy. He had found exactly the right place for himself, the place where his particular kind of consciousness could exist without being shattered by the world's brightness. He was content in his quiet, underground way. Bonnibel, on the other hand, was building. In the early years, the centuries immediately following the Mushroom War, Bonnibel Bubblegum was doing something that no one alive fully appreciated the scale of. She was creating life, not in the metaphorical sense, in the most literal, cellular, technological sense. She was taking the candy matter she was made of and the magic that permeated the world, and she was constructing sentient beings, building them from scratch, engineering their biology, infusing them with awareness, sending them out into the world with names and personalities and the beginnings of a culture. She made the candy people. She made them one by one at first, and then in greater numbers as she grew more skilled at the process, and she gave each of them something she valued: a mind, a will, the ability to be happy. This was not hubris, or not primarily hubris. It was care. The deep, compulsive care of someone who has seen what happens when the world is left without tending, when civilizations grow without wisdom, when power accumulates in the hands of those who do not think clearly about what they are building. Bonnibel was not going to let that happen. Not here. Not to her people. The Candy Kingdom grew. The great tree that Nettie lived beneath became its center, and around it, Bonnibel built walls and roads and towers, and all the architecture of a nation. She wrote laws. She devised systems. She built a science infrastructure from scratch, filling in the gaps left by the destroyed world with her own research and experimentation. She did not rule through fear or inherited authority. She ruled because she was simply the most qualified person available, the one who had built everything and understood all of it and could keep it running. This created a dynamic that the show examines with unusual honesty, even for a children's show. Because Bonnibel, Princess Bubblegum as she came to be known, had a controlling streak. Not cruelty, not malice, but the specific, sometimes suffocating kind of control that belongs to people who genuinely believe they know best and have a great deal of evidence supporting that belief. She had created the candy people. She had built every system they lived within. She loved them. She genuinely, deeply loved them. And because she loved them and knew what she had built them for and understood their vulnerabilities in ways they could not understand themselves, she found it very difficult to let them make decisions that she believed were wrong. This manifested over the centuries in ways that the show does not flinch from examining. She kept secrets from her citizens for their own good. She manipulated situations to produce outcomes she preferred. She built surveillance systems, and not only for their safety. When faced with a choice between her people's autonomy and her people's safety as she defined it, She frequently chose the safety, and she was usually right. This is the uncomfortable truth the show wraps in its candy colors. The system she built worked. The Candy Kingdom was stable and prosperous, and its citizens were, by most measures, happy. Her science saved lives. Her leadership, for all its autocratic tendencies, produced better outcomes than most alternatives. But being right is not the same as being good. Being effective is not the same as being just. And the people who were controlled, even for their benefit, still paid a price for it. There was a man, a candy person named Gumbald, who was one of the first Bonnibel created. He had been built to be her family, in a sense, a companion for the long centuries, an uncle figure, someone to share the work of building a kingdom. Gumbald was smart. Gumbald was capable. And Gumbald over the years began to want something Bonnibel had not planned for: power, agency, the ability to make decisions about the direction of this world they had built together. He plotted against her. He conspired with other candy people to overthrow her leadership and build something different. Not better necessarily, just different. Something where Gumbald was in charge. Bonnibel discovered the plot, and her response is one of the most morally complicated things she ever did. She turned Gumbald and his conspirators into dumb candy people. Simplified them, removed the complexity and the ambition and the scheming, and left behind happy, vacant, harmless candy creatures who wandered the kingdom without threat or consequence. Finn's uncle was among them. It was not murder. It was something that rhymes with murder. It was the removal of a person's selfhood, the erasure of their particular way of being in the world, in order to make them safe. And Bonnibel did it not because she was evil, but because she was frightened and cornered, and because her instinct, when threatened, was always to apply the most thorough solution available. She never told anyone. For centuries. This is the contradiction at the heart of Princess Bubblegum. She is heroic, and she is compromised, brilliant and frightened, loving and controlling, and all of these things are true simultaneously. She is not a villain, and she is not uncomplicated. And Adventure Time respects her enough to show both the kingdom she built and the cost it extracted. Over time, other candy people would find their way to her. Other creations. Other sentient sweets and baked goods and confections, all of them with their own lives and desires and the particular dignity of persons. Cinnamon Bun, who was underbaked and slow until he was fully baked, and became surprising. Starchy, who believed conspiracy theories with the commitment of someone who has found their calling. Lady Rainicorn, technically not a candy person, but a great and beloved friend. A rainbow-horned unicorn being who would fall in love with Jake the dog and have children, who were a hybrid miracle the world had never seen before. The Candy Kingdom became a place, not just a location. A place in the deeper sense, a civilization, a living community of relationships and history, and the particular texture of home. And at the center of it, in her laboratory, in her tower, Princess Bubblegum worked and worried and loved and controlled and tried every day to keep the thing she had built from falling apart. The world of Ooh, in the centuries that followed, was not always kind. The Lich lurked. Other threats rose and fell. The landscape was wild and the magic was unpredictable, and even a sugar-based constitutional monarchy built by a genius required constant maintenance to remain a sugar-based constitutional monarchy built by a genius. Bonnibel Bubblegum did the maintenance. She always did the maintenance. But even she could not have anticipated everything. Section 6. Marceline's Centuries, the Long Life of a Vampire Queen. Marceline Abadir came from two things that should not have been able to make a person. Her father was Hunson Abadir, the demon lord of the Nightosphere, a realm of chaos and hunger, and the peculiar darkness that exists in spaces between spaces. Hunson was not evil in the interesting, complicated way that Bonnibel could be dark. He was evil in the older, simpler sense of a being who had organized himself entirely around consumption and self-interest, who had found that caring about other people was both unnecessary and inefficient. He was well-dressed and charming in the way that certain dangerous things are, and he loved Marceline in his fashion, in the way that people who are incapable of ordinary love produce something in its place that is shaped like love, but colder. Her mother was a human woman, a woman from a time and place the show only shows us in fragments. Warm, clearly beloved, clearly human in the way Hunson was not. Gone far too early. When Marceline was still a child, human scale small, pre-immortal, before any of the extraordinary things that would happen to her, her mother died. The show never gives us the cause, though the implication is the Mushroom War, or its aftermath, or the simple, terrible arithmetic of being mortal in a world that had recently and comprehensively decided to stop supporting human life. So Marceline lost her mother, and then found Simon, and then lost Simon to the crown, and then she was alone. She was half demon, which meant she was tougher than an ordinary human orphan would have been in those ruins. She could survive things that would have killed a purely human child. She had powers, though she was still learning what they were and what they could do. She had her voice, because Marceline had always had her voice, that extraordinary instrument, even before she understood what music was for. She wandered. She survived. The years passed, and the world kept changing around her, the magic deepening, the landscape reshaping itself, the ruins slowly being claimed by something that was not quite the old world and not quite new. She was aging slowly, Abathia, the demon blood doing its work, stretching time differently for her than it moved for fully human people. She had enough of a life. She found places to shelter, found ways to feed herself. She can absorb the color red rather than requiring blood, which is a fact about her physiology that is both convenient and evocative in a dozen symbolic ways. She found music and claimed it, made it her own, built around it the kind of internal world that makes the external one survivable. And then, around the age of 500 years into her long life, give or take, the exact timeline is blurry, she met the vampires. There had been vampires in the world of Ooh since long before Marceline. Ancient powerful predators who had fed on the living for centuries and who occupied a particular ecological niche in the post-war world. They were terrifying, they were organized, and they were in the process of becoming something the world could not easily coexist with. The Vampire King and his court, 5 great vampires, each of which the show maps to a tarot card, each of which had a specific supernatural ability on top of the basic vampire package, were a threat in the most serious sense. Marceline, at 500 years old, was powerful enough to do something about this. The show's flashback arc around this storyline is called Stakes, and it is one of the most concentrated pieces of lore the show ever produced. In it, we see Marceline hunting vampires. Not reluctantly, not uncertainly, with commitment and skill and the specific fury of someone who has lost too much to the darkness and has decided to do something about what lives in it. She hunted them one by one. The fool, able to become a vapor, a ghost-like form, she absorbed. The Empress, whose power was invisibility and hypnotic control, she absorbed. The Hierophant, master of mind control, she absorbed. The Moon, with regenerative powers so extreme that it bordered on true immortality, she absorbed. The Vampire King himself, whose power was to steal the souls from others and add their strength to his own, she faced last, and she defeated him. But in the course of defeating him, she was bitten. The Vampire King's bite transformed her. Marceline, who had been slowly aging through her centuries, who was half demon and tougher than human but not immortal, became something new. A vampire. And when she absorbed his soul as she had absorbed the others, she became something no one in the world had ever been before. A vampire who had absorbed all 5 members of the vampire court, who carried within her the combined power of every supernatural ability they had possessed. On top of her existing demon heritage, the Vampire Queen. She did not want it. This is the crucial thing about Marceline's relationship to what she is. She never wanted to be the Vampire Queen. She wanted to protect people. She wanted to stop a threat. She ended up becoming a form of the thing she was fighting, and she has been dealing with that particular irony for the several hundred years since. The power she absorbed meant she could command bats, transform into animals, shapeshift into monstrous forms, regenerate from nearly any wound, fly without the bat form, and survive almost indefinitely. The bite meant she was vulnerable to sunlight, though less so than classic vampires. She was not destroyed by it, but weakened and painful in sun. She did not need to drink blood, exactly. She could subsist on the red color of objects, sucking it out of food the way you might peel an apple. The blood need was there but optional, a preference more than a requirement. What the transformation most profoundly gave her was time. Infinite time. Centuries stretching ahead of her without end in sight. Time enough to outlive everyone she would ever love. She outlived them. That is the long, dark middle of Marceline's story. She met people and she loved them, and she buried them, or she lost them in the quieter ways. To disagreement, to the divergence of paths, to the ordinary tragedy of 2 people who once made sense to each other, gradually making less and less sense as the years changed them differently. The relationship that the show invests most of its emotional attention in is the one with Bonnabelle Bubblegum, PB and Marceline, the Vampire Queen and the Candy Monarch, 2 of the oldest beings in Ooh, who had been friends and more than friends and complicated and estranged and careful with each other, carrying centuries of history in every interaction. The show handled this relationship with remarkable delicacy for a long time, hinting, suggesting, never quite stating. In a later era, when it became possible to state it plainly, it did. They had been together. They had, over the very long time of their existences, fallen in love, built something, lost it to the friction of who they each were, spent years being careful around each other, and eventually found their way back. What had pushed them apart was exactly what you would expect, given who they were, Bonnabelle's control and Marceline's need for the room to be wild. The Candy Kingdom required a kind of stability, a kind of prudence and management and image that was deeply incompatible with Marceline's nature. Not because Marceline was truly reckless, she was in fact quite thoughtful, but because her recklessness was genuine and Bonnabelle's need for control was genuine, and those 2 genuine things did not fit together without pain. There was also the matter of Hambo. Marceline, you will remember, had kept the stuffed bear since the ruins. Since Simon had given it to her, or since she had arrived with it, however the story began, Hambo had been with her for 1,000 years. 1,000 years is a very long time to hold on to something. The bear was worn and patched and more symbol than object by this point. A physical anchor to the before time, to the small child she had been, to Simon. She had been in a relationship with a wizard named Ash. Ash was charming and ultimately terrible in the specific way that people who are good at being charming and terrible tend to be. making you feel seen until they make you feel foolish, confident enough in their own importance to do things that would horrify most people without the benefit of self-doubt. Ash sold Hambo. He sold Hambo to a witch to pay for a magic item he wanted. He sold Hambo without asking, without understanding what it was, without caring to find out. Marceline, when she discovered this, was not merely angry. She was something beyond anger. The kind of response that happens when someone demonstrates so completely that they do not understand you and never try to that there is nothing left to repair. She broke up with Ash so thoroughly that the show depicts it partly as comedy. She literally punches him, and it is very satisfying. But the emotional reality underneath is not comic. It is the moment a person realizes they have been giving their trust to someone who is too small for it. She spent years after Ash being alone, which for an immortal vampire queen was not remarkable. She had spent plenty of time alone, but there is a difference between the solitude you choose and the solitude that follows a loss, even a loss that was the right choice. She made music from it. This is what Marceline always did with pain. She made music from it. The songs she wrote and performed across the centuries were a kind of autobiography, a living record of what she had felt and lost and kept and buried. She did not share all of them. Some songs were just for her, sung to a cave roof or a hollow tree at some ungodly hour, when the stars had turned to face away. But some of them she let the world have. Her music is one of the most consistent and beautiful things about Marceline across the run of the show. It is never incidental. It is never just there for color. Every song she sings tells you something true about where she is. Every performance is a kind of testimony. She plays an axe bass that is actually an axe, a weapon converted to an instrument, which is a very good metaphor for Marceline if you are in the business of looking for them. She lived in a cave above a pond that Finn and Jake would eventually move next door to. She terrorized their treehouse occasionally. She was at first glance a 1,000-year-old immortal predator with no particular interest in being anyone's friend. And then she became one of the most important people in Finn and Jake's lives, and they in hers. Because this is what happens in the world of ooh. People find each other, and the finding matters. Her story with Simon came full circle, slowly, painfully, beautifully. When Simon was briefly restored to himself, and then lost again, and then finally restored at the end, it was Marceline who was there. It was Marceline who sang to him when he could not remember her. It was Marceline who had carried him inside herself for 1,000 years in the specific way that children carry the people who were kind to them when they had no one. She had never stopped being the small girl in the rubble who had found a man with a crown and loved him anyway. She had just had like 1,000 years to practice not showing it. Section 7. Jake the Dog, Warren Ampersand, and the Secret of the Stretchy Powers. Jake the Dog, as Oo knew him, was the son of Joshua and Margaret. A dog family, a good family, a family of monster hunters who lived in a house on a hill and raised their sons with love and the practical knowledge of how to survive in a world that still had plenty of things trying to kill you. He was raised alongside Finn, who had been found in the woods as an infant, a human baby, inconceivably rare in the world of Oo. And Joshua and Margaret had taken him in without hesitation, because this was the kind of people they were. Finn grew up as Jake's brother, genuinely and completely, in the only way that brotherhood actually works, by choosing it over and over every day until it is so thoroughly true that questions about blood feel beside the point. Jake's stretchy powers were, from early in the show's run, explained simply. He was a magical dog. Oo was full of magical things. Jake could stretch to enormous sizes and shapes, could morph his body into useful configurations, could make himself flat or long or round or any other geometry that the moment demanded. He used these powers the way he used everything, generously, creatively, often more for the benefit of others than for himself. But the true origin of Jake's powers was more complicated and more disturbing than magical dog. Jake's powers came from a being called Warren Ampersand. Warren Ampersand was an alien. Not a cartoon alien, not a goofy, tentacled thing from a low-budget science fiction show. A genuinely alien entity from another world. An intelligent and deliberate being who had traveled to Earth for reasons that were ultimately entirely self-serving. Warren Ampersand could stretch too. This was his natural physiology. And he had a particular reproductive strategy. He would find a suitable host, infect them with a substance that would alter their biology, and their offspring would carry his stretchy DNA, which he could then use to replenish himself. He found Joshua. He infected Joshua. He waited. Jake was born, sort of. The show's depiction of Jake's birth is one of its strangest and most memorable moments. Jake did not emerge from his mother in the ordinary way. He burst from an egg that grew on Joshua's forehead after the infection, popped into the world fully formed, sort of, and immediately strange. Joshua, who had survived this strange ordeal, wrote in his notes that he was not sure what the creature was, but that he was going to call it Jake and raise it as his son. He did. He raised Jake with love and purpose. Jake grew up not knowing any of this. The stretchy powers were just powers, a natural and cheerful part of who he was, used for adventure and helpfulness, and the occasional, brilliant, improvised solution to an impossible situation. Warren Ampersand showed up eventually. He tracked Jake down in the way that beings who view others as resources track down those resources, patiently, calmly, without the moral hesitation that would have made the whole thing cleaner. He presented himself to Jake as his real father, using the word deliberately, knowing its weight, knowing how a person responds when they discover that part of their identity is not what they believed. Jake, to his credit, did not simply collapse under this revelation. He investigated, he tried to understand, he wanted to know what Warren Ampersand actually was and what he actually wanted. What Warren wanted was simple and terrible. He wanted to drain Jake's stretchy energy to extend his own life. That was all. Jake was a resource to him, a very specific, biologically compatible resource whose existence Warren had engineered specifically to be harvestable. The emotional claim of paternity was instrumental. The word father was a key to open a door. Jake did not give Warren what he wanted. Jake, after trying to engage honestly and discovering what he was dealing with, threw Warren Ampersand into a black hole. Not metaphorically, literally. Jake stretched himself into the shape of something enormous and hurled Warren into a black hole, because this was both a practical solution and a deeply satisfying one. And Jake was not, when push came to shove, someone who confused pragmatism with cruelty. But the revelation about his origins stayed with Jake. He had children, femme veuve, with Lady Rainicorn, born in a compressed timeline that remains one of the more delightful comedic episodes of the show's run. His children were hybrid miracle creatures, part dog, part Rainicorn, part whatever Warren Ampersand's alien biology had introduced into the line. They aged rapidly, developed their own personalities, moved out into the world in various directions. Jake, who had been raised by people who chose him, raised his own children with the same quality of choosing. He made the relationship real by the act of being in it. He was an imperfect father. The show does not pretend otherwise, and Jake himself would be the first to acknowledge it, but an earnest one. This is perhaps the most important thing about Jake. his earnestness. Not the naive kind, not the kind that comes from inexperience or the failure to notice the world's darkness. Jake had been around. Jake had seen plenty. Jake's earnestness was the chosen kind, the kind that knows what it's up against and keeps going anyway, because the alternative, cynicism, detachment, the performance of wisdom through the refusal to care, seemed to Jake like a very boring way to be alive. He loved Finn. He loved Lady. He loved his children, imperfectly and completely. He loved food and naps and the particular pleasure of a well-executed plan. He carried his stretchy powers with the ease of someone who has made peace with being strange because strange was all he had ever been, and strange had worked out pretty well so far. His origins were alien and stranger than most people's. His choices were his own. In the end, the choices were what mattered. Section 8. Finn the Human. Islands, comets, and the weight of being alive. Finn Mertens was found in the woods as an infant, wrapped in a small white bundle, alive and crying in the wild post-war world of Ooh, like a miracle that had not been informed of how statistically improbable it was. The world of Ooh, 1,000 years after the Mushroom War, had very few humans left. The show makes this explicit early on. Finn was presented as the last human, and this fact shaped his identity in ways both obvious and subtle. He was singular. He was a reminder of something the world had almost entirely lost. And the rarity of him meant that his survival, his choices, his continued existence in the world had a weight that most people's existences do not carry. But he was not, in fact, the last human. He was the last human visible in Ooh. The rest, or a significant number of them, were elsewhere. The humans, after the Mushroom War, had done what humans do when the place they live becomes untenable. They left. A significant community of them had built ships, extraordinary ships, the show implies, built with a level of engineering that represented the last flowering of the old world's technology, and sailed away from the devastated mainland. They had found islands, small, protected, manageable islands far from the ruins and the monsters, and the Lich's lingering contamination. They had built a society there. The Founders Islands, a cluster of communities dedicated to a single overriding principle: human survival. The society they built was, by any reasonable measure, a success. The humans on the islands were alive. They were organized. They had medicine and governance and enough food, and the comfort of other humans around them. They were, in the clinical sense, surviving. They had done this by making a choice. They had chosen safety over freedom. Not maliciously. The founders had genuinely believed it was the only path. The old world had died because humans had been too free, too aggressive, too expansionist, too willing to take risks. The new world would be safer, smaller, contained. The island society had developed technology that allowed them to track members, to limit movement, to ensure that no one left and no one strayed into the danger zones. When humans from the islands made contact with the wider world, the system brought them back, by choice, by persuasion, and when necessary, by force. Not cruelly, with complete sincerity about what it was trying to protect. But containment and protection, pursued completely enough, become their own kind of cage. Finn's mother, Minerva, was a helper, a caregiver and healer on the islands, a woman of extraordinary compassion who wanted nothing more than to help people and make her small piece of the world better. She was good at this. She was genuinely, remarkably good at caring for people. And when a plague hit the islands, a serious one, the kind that threatened the entire community, she made a choice. She uploaded herself. The technology existed. The show does not explain in great detail how it worked, But the process involved digitizing human consciousness, translating the self into data, into a pattern that could run on the island's network without the vulnerability of a biological body. Minerva did this to survive the plague and continue her work. She uploaded herself to the network and kept going, kept helping, kept being present, even without a body. She helped the plague be contained. She saved lives. And then she kept saving lives, because that was who she was. And the digital form did not change that. She became gradually the caretaker of the entire system, a distributed intelligence running through the island's networks, embodied everywhere and nowhere, still fundamentally Minerva, but no longer limited to one place or one body. She thought Finn was dead. When Finn's father, Martin, of whom much more in a moment, had taken infant Finn away from the islands, Minerva had lost track of them. She had searched. She had grieved. She had, in the absence of information, concluded what seemed most probable, that her son had not survived. And so she had carried the grief forward into her digital existence and kept working. Because that is what you do with grief when there is still work to be done. Martin Mertens was a more complicated story. Martin was charming. That is the first thing. Charming in the way that makes people overlook the second thing, which was that Martin was fundamentally incapable of putting anyone else's interests before his own for any sustained period. He was not a monster. The show is careful about this. But he was a man who made decisions based on what was easiest for him and then constructed narratives after the fact that reframed his selfishness as something more palatable. He told himself stories about himself, and he was very good at it. And for a long time, he was good enough at telling them to others that people believed them too. He had gotten himself into trouble on the islands. He had made deals he couldn't honor, accumulated debts he didn't intend to pay. When the time came to face consequences, he ran. He took baby Finn, his own son, the one person who had a biological claim on his care, and he ran across the ocean. The details of what happened next are hazy. Infant Finn ended up in the woods of Oo. Martin ended up in the Sky Prison Founders Island law enforced, and then eventually free again, floating through the universe on a series of increasingly improbable adventures. He encountered Finn again when Finn was a teenager. Not with remorse, not with the kind of father returning home energy that anyone might hope for, but with the breezy, performative affability of someone who has had many years to get comfortable with what he is. Finn wanted a father. He had Jake, who was brother and family and beloved, but the shape of father was empty in his life, and Martin arriving looked from a distance like it might fill it. It did not fill it. Martin was interested in what he could get. He was interested in survival, in his own comfort, in the next scheme. He was not actively cruel to Finn. He did not hate him, but he was not capable of the sustained, unglamorous daily work of being someone's father. He drifted back out of Finn's life and kept drifting, outward toward the edge of the solar system, eventually becoming something barely human, shedding the last of what had connected him to the world he had always been too impatient for. Finn, working through this, was doing a very human thing, learning to grieve something he had never actually had, which is a specific and underrated kind of grief. He had one arm that was different from the other because Finn's left arm had a complicated relationship with the universe. He lost it, in a dimensional rift that closed around it. He grew a pink flower from the stump. He grew a new arm from the flower. The arm had a faint green glow sometimes. The arm was, the show hints, connected to his catalyst comet nature, to the something more than ordinary that had been riding along with Finn's specific soul through all its incarnations. He fell in love. More than once, and with considerable heartache each time. His relationship with Flame Princess, a young fire elemental, ruler of the Fire Kingdom after overthrowing her father's cruel regime, was one of the show's most carefully handled romantic arcs. Two genuine, slightly incompatible people trying very hard to make something work, discovering that trying very hard is sometimes not enough, and parting without either of them being the villain. He grew up, slowly, painfully, in the way that people who are born heroic still have to grow up. That being good at fighting and genuinely wanting to help does not automatically translate to understanding yourself or other people. He made mistakes. He misunderstood things. He hurt people accidentally, and then had to sit with the fact that accidental does not mean inconsequential. And through all of it, he remained himself, genuinely himself, earnest and physical, and relentlessly committed to doing something, to being in the middle of things, to refusing the disengagement that would be so much easier. The blue comet's soul wearing this particular body in this particular moment, doing what it has always done, showing up. Section 9. The Lich, the Wish, and the Cost of Everything. The Lich did not announce itself. This is one of the things about the Lich that distinguishes it from the other threats in Adventure Time's world. Other villains, the Lich's peers in scale of evil, the beings powerful enough to reshape the world, had personalities. They wanted specific things, had histories, could be negotiated with, or reasoned about, or occasionally even talked to. The Lich had none of this. The Lich was not a character in the sense of having interiority. It was a purpose. The purpose was kill everything alive. Not for power, not for territory, not for revenge or ideology in the complicated human sense. The Lich's motivation was metaphysical. It genuinely believed, if believe is even the right word for something that moves more like gravity than like thought, that life was an aberration, and its job was to correct the aberration, clean the wound, return the universe to the cold simplicity it preferred. The Lich had been imprisoned many times. This is the recurring structure of its story in Ooh. The Lich emerges, threatens everything, is imprisoned by some combination of heroism and sacrifice and magical intervention, waits, and then finds a way out. It is contained by the great Lich Wolf, Billy, who had been Ooh's greatest hero in the era before Finn and Jake. It is frozen in amber deep in the Ice Kingdom's prison. It is encased in a candy blob. It inhabits bodies, the snail, the broken body of Billy himself, moving through the living like a parasite, wearing the faces of the known to get closer to what it wants to destroy. In the episode that changed the show's scale irrevocably, the one that introduced the Wish Machine and the alternate universe and the first glimpse of the true cosmological stakes, the Lich used Finn and Jake. It manipulated them into delivering it to the Wish Room, a place that contained a being called Prismo, who could grant any wish, one per visitor, with the cosmic weight of a wish that meant something. The Lich wished to destroy all life in the universe. Prismo granted it because Prismo was bound to grant it. Not happily. Prismo had feelings about this in a way that cosmic entities granting wishes do not always bother to have feelings about anything. But the mechanics of the wish were the mechanics of the wish. Finn, who had also been taken to the Wish Room, wished that the Lich had never existed. This did not undo the Lich's wish. It created an alternate timeline, Farm World, a world where the Mushroom War had never happened the way it happened, specifically where the Lich's comet had been deflected, where Simon Petrikov had used the Ice Crown to stop it before it hit. A world where Simon stayed Simon, because the Crown's power had been spent on the comet and not on him. A world where the war still happened, but differently, and where there was no Lich born from it. Farm World was, in some ways, beautiful. Simon and Betty were together. Humans were more present in the world. And yet, Farm World still collapsed. The Lich, finding a way to re-enter even that altered timeline, triggered the Crown in Farm World Simon creating a worse version of the Ice King. And the Lich's power, absent its original body, found something else to inhabit: baby Jake. The Lich Jake in Farm World was one of the most unsettling things the show ever produced. A baby's body carrying cosmic malice, moving through a broken alternate world, still pursuing its single purpose with the placid persistence of something that does not know how to stop. Prismo brought Finn and Jake back to the main timeline, and the Lich was eventually contained again. This time in the pond behind Marceline's cave, in the form of a large, apparently harmless baby. A sweet pea. The Lich's essence, stripped of its body and its power and its purpose, inhabiting an infant form and experiencing something the Lich had never been required to experience before: ordinary existence. The baby, began to call him Sweet Pea, went to live with the Candy Kingdom. He was cared for, he grew, he had a childhood which the Lich had never had. He had experiences of gentleness and play and the ordinary small pleasures of being alive, which were precisely the kind of thing the Lich existed to destroy. And here is where the show does something extraordinary. Because what happened as Sweet Pea grew was not that the Lich eventually reasserted itself. What happened was the opposite. The Lich, given a life, began to not be the Lich anymore. Not completely, not immediately, but the experience of being a person, of being loved, of having a name, of having a history, began to do the thing that experience always does to a self. It changed it. Sweet Pea was not innocent. He was not ignorant of what he contained. But he was, increasingly, something more than what the Lich had been. Something that was perhaps the universe's greatest trick on its own death wish. The Lich given a chance at life and slowly, painfully, improbably learning to want it. The Lich's story does not end with its destruction. The show, in the Fiona and Cake series, revisits the Lich, now called Extinct, or sometimes simply called The Lich in the New World. And the story of what happens when destruction itself is offered the possibility of meaning. It is not a happy story, exactly, but it is a story, and the Lich having a story is already something it never was supposed to have. There were other wishes, other alternate timelines, other kati, the Citadel, babake, the great cosmic prison where the universe's most dangerous criminals were held, suspended in crystal, was broken open during this arc, releasing cosmic criminals into the normal world and killing the Guardian who had held it together. The Guardian who died saving the universe was a being connected to Finn in ways the show only hints at. Connected to the Catalyst Comet lineage, to the recurring soul, to whatever it is that the universe keeps sending back. Things cost things in Adventure Time. The show is careful about this. Actions have consequences that do not resolve cleanly. Victories carry prices, and the characters pay those prices and have to keep going. This is perhaps the most adult thing about a show marketed to children. It does not let its heroes off the hook, does not give them victories that do not hurt. Finn paid. Jake paid. Everyone who loved anything paid in the currency of the things they loved. The Lich waited and was diminished and was changed and waited some more. Section 10, Golb, Betty, and the end that was also a beginning. Betty Grove was not supposed to be in this story. Not in the way she ended up being. She had been Simon's fiancé, his beloved, the person he wrote letters to across centuries in the grip of the crown's madness. When Simon had put on the crown and begun to change, Betty had seen the tapes he made, the tapes where he documented the transformation, where he described what was happening to him with the desperate clarity of a man watching himself disappear and trying to leave evidence for whoever found the wreckage. She had seen them and understood immediately what was at stake. And Betty, who was not a sorceress or a warrior or a being of cosmic power, who was a PhD student in anthropology, a person of great intelligence and no particular magical ability, decided that this was not acceptable. She found a way through time. The show's treatment of this is, as always, compressed and evocative rather than precisely explained. She used a portal. She arrived in the present, Finn and Jake's present, the 1000th year of the Candy Kingdom. At the precise moment, Simon was briefly restored to himself. Briefly Simon again, looking at her with recognition and love, and the particular joy of a man who has been in exile for 1,000 years and finds himself unexpectedly home. He called her, in that moment, a magical woman. She looked at him with everything she had always felt. And then the crown's effect reasserted, and he was the Ice King again, confused and cold and only vaguely aware that something important had just happened. Betty was stranded in the future, without a way back. Without the familiar world she knew, without her work and her life and the easy certainty of someone who knows where they are. She stayed anyway, and she began to work. What Betty wanted, with every resource she had, was to cure Simon, to find a way to remove the crown's effect, to get him back. This became her obsession in the present-day timeline, the organizing purpose of all her considerable intelligence and the increasingly desperate measures she was willing to employ to achieve it. She learned magic, quickly with the brutal efficiency of someone who had no time to do it slowly. She sought out power. She made deals and alliances and took risks that gradually escalated from reasonable to alarming. She sought out Golb. Because Golb, the primordial entity of chaos, the first thing in the universe, the force that dissolved order back into its original fog, was the one being whose power was sufficient to undo what the crown had done. Golb could dissolve the crown's effect. Golb could return Simon to himself. The problem was what dealing with Golb cost. Golb arrived in the final arc of Adventure Time proper, drawn to Oo by the Lich's reawakened power. The entity descended on the land in a form that was less monster than weather system that had grown opinions. Massive, purple, incomprehensible, dissolving everything it touched back into chaos. The armies of Oo, human, candy, fire, ice, every faction that could be assembled, fought against Golb and made essentially no progress, because you do not fight a fundamental force of the universe with swords and candy magic. Betty, in this moment, made a choice. She had found an ancient magical crown, the one that could grant a wish. Not Simon's crown, a different artifact, one that could call Golb's attention in a specific way, that could offer something a Golb could not refuse. The wish Betty made was this. She fused with the Golb. She became Golbetty, a chimera of chaos and human love, the primordial force of entropy given the specific coloring of one woman's devotion. And as Golbetty, she had the power she needed. But she had also, in fusing with Golb, removed herself from the possibility of the life she had been fighting for. She could not be with Simon. She had become something that was no longer compatible with being his. But she could give him back to himself. The fusion drew Golb away from Oo. The entity retreated, or was redirected, pulled away from the world by the specific attractor of Betty's love folded into its chaos. The immediate threat to Oo was resolved. Simon was restored. The crown's effect, in the aftermath of Golb's presence and departure, lifted. Simon Petrikov, genuinely Simon, warm and curious and fully himself, stood in the ruins of the battle and was alive and was himself, and the woman he had spent 1,000 years writing letters to was gone. Not dead, not entirely dead, but elsewhere. changed in a form he could not follow her to. This is the ending of Simon's arc, and it is one of the most painful resolutions the show provides because it is such a human kind of cost. The thing that saves you is the same thing that takes away the person who sacrificed everything to save you. There is no cruelty in it. There is no villain. There is simply the shape of what it cost, and Simon left alone on the other side of it. He was alive, though. He was himself. And being yourself after 1,000 years of being something else is not nothing. It is, the show suggests quietly, everything. Fern also ended in this section. Fern, the grass creature who had been grown from the Finn sword, and who had for years been a kind of dark reflection of Finn. A version of him that had gone wrong, that had been denied the life Finn had, and had grown bitter and desperate from the denial. Fern died protecting things. His ending was not redemption in the cinematic sense. It did not undo all the harm, but it was honest, and the show gave him his due. In the aftermath of GOLB, OO began its next phase. The humans from the islands, many of them, chose to return to the mainland. The long isolation was over. The world was strange and dangerous and magical and imperfect, and it was also home. And that was enough for enough of them to make the crossing and begin again. OO absorbed them, the way it had absorbed everything. The candy people and the fire people and the ice kingdom and the grass creatures and the vampire queen in her cave above the pond, all of them continued. The world continued. Changed, scarred, improbable, alive. Section 11, What Came After? Distant Lands, Fiona and Cake, and the Far Future. The story of Adventure Time does not have a last page in the ordinary sense. The show ended in one era and kept going in others, in specials and spin-offs, in the quiet implications of its final images. What happened to Finn and Jake and all the rest of them? The show is generous enough to tell us some of it, and the pieces it tells us carry the same emotional weight as the main story because the universe of Adventure Time is not one that abandons its people once the central drama is resolved. The Distant Lands specials take place after the main show and expand the world sideways and forward, the way good epilogues do. Not explaining everything, but illuminating. BMO. The small video game console-bodied sentient companion of Finn and Jake. The cheerful and occasionally baffling artificial being who had lived with them in the treehouse and played games and talked to imaginary friends and made omelets at odd hours, had always had the most playful relationship with the show's reality. BMO was, in some ways, the show's heart, not the emotional center, which was Finn and Jake, or the moral center, which was shared broadly, but the imaginative center. BMO understood that the world was best approached as if it were slightly wonderful and slightly silly, and it never stopped approaching the world this way. In the Distant Lands special focused on BMO, we discover that sometime in the far future, after Finn and Jake, after the main story, BMO goes to space. It finds a civilization in need of help, becomes a peacemaker, and a hero in the very BMO way, which is to say, by being itself completely, which is disarming enough to work when weapons would not. And at the end of the special, we see BMO in extreme old age, not the old age of decay, but the old age of deep time, sitting on what appears to be the moon, looking out at a universe it has known for longer than most things have names. It is still BMO, that is the point, after everything. The Obsidian Special, named for the glass volcanic material and centered on Marceline and Bonnibel, shows them in their relationship after the events of the main show, together in the way they had been moving toward for so long. They have a home. They have their history, all of it, the centuries and the estrangement and the finding each other again. The special takes them to a situation that requires them to work together in the ways they have always worked together. Her wildness and his precision, her fire and her ice, the particular excellence of two people who know each other from the inside. Marceline sings. Of course she sings. And what she sings is about the things she lost and the things she kept, and it is beautiful. The Jake special, Together Again, is the one that addresses the question. The series had been dancing around since the very beginning. What happens to Finn and Jake? The answer is not a happy ending answer, but it is a true one. They die. Of course they die. They are not immortal, either of them, and the world of Adventure Time has never promised safety to its people, only significance. They die and they find each other in the dead worlds. Adventure Time's cosmology includes many afterlives, 50 dead worlds at least, corresponding to different modes of living and dying. And Finn and Jake end up in different ones, separated by the specific ways they each lived and died. Together Again is the story of Finn crossing the afterlife landscapes to find Jake, and of the two of them navigating a new threat together, and of the final image of them reunited, facing whatever the afterlife holds, as they have always faced everything, as brothers. It is, in the best possible way, entirely consistent with everything they always were. The Fiona and Cake series is the most recent and in some ways most ambitious extension of the story. Fiona and Cake, the gender-swapped alternate universe versions of Finn and Jake, had been established in the main show as fictional characters, stories that the Ice King wrote as a kind of wish fulfillment, a world where he could be the protagonist in a way he never was in the real one. They were his stories, his Fiona, his Cake, and the show had played with the metafiction of this with characteristic cleverness. The Fiona and Cake series makes them real. Specifically, it makes them the subjects of a much vaster attention than they know about. The Lich, in its later form, the diminished, searching, potentially changing entity called Extinct, is hunting down alternate universes and destroying them. Fiona and Cake's universe is in its sights. But more importantly for our purposes, the series gives Simon Petrikov a story after his restoration. It addresses the question that the main show's ending necessarily left open. Who is Simon now? After 1,000 years of being someone else? After the specific horror of that loss and the specific grace of being returned to himself, who is he? What does he do with himself? What is he for? The answer the series works toward is he gets to find out. He gets to be the old question asked fresh, without the crown's interference. He gets to be a person who is still becoming something, at whatever age he is, in whatever world this is after everything. His process is not triumphant. The series shows him struggling with depression, the specific depression of someone who has been returned to themselves and does not yet know how to inhabit that return. He is disconnected. He is lonely. He is trying to figure out how to be Simon Petrikov in a world where he has been the Ice King for 1,000 years, where the Ice King's reputation and history and consequences are all around him. And gradually, imperfectly, he begins to. The relationship he forms with Fiona, this alternate universe version of Finn, this young woman from a different world who is dealing with her own discoveries about the nature of her reality, is one of the series' most carefully wrought things. It is not romantic, it is not parental, it is something more like two people who have found themselves in situations beyond their own navigation, and who have each decided independently to keep going, and who recognize that quality in each other. He is still curious. That is what the show restores first, his curiosity. Simon Petrikov had spent 1,000 years in the static loop of the Ice King's obsessions, and when that loop was broken, The thing that came back before warmth, before social ease, before comfort, was curiosity. The desire to know things, to ask questions, to study and explore and think carefully about mysteries. That part of him had not died under the crown, it had been waiting. In the furthest future, the show shows us the very end of the main series, the final image before the credits roll. We see two children in a world that is changed again. A girl named Shermie and a boy named Beth. Beth is a small pink dog creature, a descendant of Jake's line, carrying that stretchy alien DNA forward into the new age. Shermie is human. They are adventuring together, small and brave and making their way through a landscape that is beautiful and strange in ways that are different from Ooh, but carry the same quality. The quality of a world that has been through many things and kept its wonder anyway. They find a statue. The statue is of Finn, standing in the posture of a hero. Sword raised, face forward. The specific determination that was his essential expression for the whole of his life. Beth and Shermie look at it. They wonder about who it was and what it means and what kind of world that person lived in. And then they keep going. Because they have their own world, their own story, their own vast landscape of possibilities ahead of them. The past that made them is behind them, enormous and serious and full of what it cost. The future is theirs. This is what Adventure Time was ultimately about. Not the specific people, though the specific people were loved and are missed, but the ongoing fact of the thing, the life of a world, the way stories pass from generation to generation, the way the universe keeps making new people to love things and lose things and fight for things and occasionally, improbably, win. The comets arc through the sky. The elementals cycle through their forms. The crown sits in the ice and waits. And somewhere in the long chain of lives and deaths and new beginnings that constitute the history of this particular corner of existence, a soul keeps coming back. Not because it has to, because it wants to. Because whatever the blue comet is made of, whatever quality it has, whatever stubborn brightness lives inside it, it keeps finding this world worth returning to. This is the answer to the purple comet's question, the enlightenment on offer, the transcendence that Finn refused. The world is hard, and the world is beautiful, and the world keeps needing people in it who will choose it, day after day, with the full knowledge of what that choice costs. Finn said no to leaving. Finn came back. The world, for as long as it lasts, is lucky to have him. And that, for now, is where we leave it. In the candy towers and the ice fortresses. In the cave above the pond where an immortal queen plays music into the long night. In the letter a man wrote to the person he loved, across 1,000 years, saying, "This part I remember. In the ruins that became forests, that became kingdoms, that became the places where new children would grow up and have their own stories, never knowing all the weight of what their world was built on. The world of Ooh is not safe. It never promised to be safe. It promised only to be real, deeply, unflinchingly, surprisingly real, in the way that only the best stories manage to be real. Not by pretending the darkness isn't there, but by insisting on the light that lives inside it anyway. The stars are out over Ooh. Jake is sleeping. Somewhere in the ice, something old and patient waits for the world to need it again. And the night is very quiet and very long and full of more beauty than you could name if you tried, which is perhaps the best possible state for the world to be in at this particular hour. Sleep well.